Well, Fred, we are back once again with Axiom 3. And I think
Nice.
almost we got ahead of ourselves last time. I seem to remember we promised our listeners we were going to start with homoousios. In fact, Polanus is going a bit slower than we wanted to go.
That's right. Yeah, I think, I mean, both Axiom 3 and then the next one we'll do Axiom 4, he's playing on things you can do with the word ousia. And so the baseline for him is the right answer, homoousios. Um, so in both Axioms 3 and 4, he's going to do variations, some kind of creative variations on what you can say about the Father and the Son and the Spirit with reference to their ousia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
But in
think that's
Axiom
great.
3, yeah, you're right. The starting point is something like, should we say the Father and the Son have uh, an essence that is similar or dissimilar? Might be kind of I don't know if that's like a scholastic way to pose it. Is it similar or is it dissimilar?
Yeah, and if you weren't careful and you posed that question to somebody very quickly, we might go immediately to say, "Oh, of course they're not dissimilar; they're similar." But in fact,
Right.
Polanus is going to deny both of those.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a trap, right? It's you can't get the right answer if that's an A or B question
Right,
because the Father's essence is neither similar nor dissimilar to the Son's essence.
right.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. This short axiom ends with a couple of quotations, one from Basil the Great and one from Athanasius. And that Athanasius quote that Polanus ends with is, "Whoever takes away from the Son, with the result that he, the Son, is not consubstantial with the Father, but makes him similar to the Father, denies that the Son is God."
Yeah, yeah, and I think the quote, at least for me, summarizes the high point of the Axiom 3. And again, as you mentioned rightly, uh, Axiom 3 is kind of a propedeutic for Axiom 4, where he's going to affirm, of course, the orthodox position of homoousios. And so he starts off denying the dissimilarity, and then he moves to the similarity, or the homoiousios. And I don't know about you, Fred, but I'm always afraid that I'm not going to pronounce
Yeah.
that quite as I ought to, and suddenly I'll land into heresy. But just for our listeners who might not be familiar, what's the difference between homoousios and homoiousios?
Yeah. So homo makes it the same, and homoi makes it similar.
Right. And that
Yeah.
difference of that I is the difference of an orthodox versus unorthodox position.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Kind of
guess it's
funny.
the smallest letter in Greek. The I is not even, the iota is not even dotted, right? So it's just one little,
Yeah.
one mark of the pen. And
Yeah.
somewhere, I think, is it in the 19th century that it became popular to make fun of Trinitarianism? I can't remember who started this sort of jeer, which was, oh, really? Does everything about your idea of God come down to the smallest letter in the Greek
A
alphabet? Could it
stroke of a
really?
pen. Oh,
Yeah, the
wow.
stroke of a pen. Could the difference between homoousios and homoiousios really determine the Christian doctrine of God?
Yeah.
It's a cute line. It might work in a public debate. Uh, but if you think about it for a minute, the difference between no money and $1 million is also the stroke of a pen. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
very strategically placed one at the beginning of a series of zeros,
Yeah.
utterly transforms everything we're talking about.
Yeah, and as the reforms are always fond of saying, we're not so much concerned over having a war of words. It's not about reducing it to, you know, whether you affirm this word or that word, but rather what those words have come to mean, and especially as they stand in for a really long debate process where this difference kind of became the shibboleth of a test case of orthodoxy. And so you're right. I don't I've not heard that remark, but it sounds like something someone in the 19th century might comment on. But it's really about what these two titles signify as far as positions go. That's of concern.
Yeah. This quote, by the way, that we're citing, that Polanus cites from Athanasius, whoever takes away from the Son with the result that he is not consubstantial with the Father, but makes him similar to the Father, denies that the Son is God. I can't find this quote. I couldn't find it in any of the Athanasius stuff that I had available to me. So I kind of Googled around for it, and it seems to be from a spurious work, at least a dubious work.
Okay.
Which is often the case with Athanasius. He was so popular and influential that a lot of works, sort of gravitated towards his name.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is in something called the Contra Hippocrisem Mileti. It's against the Meletians and Paul of Samosata, if I'm saying that right. And as far as I can tell, it's a dubious work. It's not clear that it's by him. Mm. But as is so often the case, and especially with someone like Polanus, who's being sort of conservative and encyclopedic, he is not himself a patristic scholar. He's sort of benefiting from the wave of patristic scholarship going on in the early Reformation. He's often just sort of, he might be using a florilegium here,
yeah,
right? He might have a set of key quotes on homoousios that have been culled from patristic writings.
Yeah. You're definitely right, and you also mentioned, though, at one point, I think correctly, like in a blog post, about the one work that Polanus wrote early on. Was it the Symphonia?
Symphonia Catholica.
Yeah, and that's a collection of patristic inspired ideas, and the Reformed were very concerned, as we know, of going back to the sources and going back to the fathers. And in fact, one comment, I guess we'll save it for next time, but I think it's at the end of Axiom 4, he's concerned with how ancient a position is, and he makes this rather cheeky remark that I'm excited to get to next time about that. But yeah. So even if they weren't always doing all the historical spade work that we would want to do today, they were certainly grasping the patristic spirit as it was differentiated in various fathers. And certainly this comment by Athanasius or somebody else is orthodox enough, and Polanus has picked it up here as a good way to summarize his position.
Yeah, and the one reason that this sentence, on the hypothesis that it's kind of gotten handed down in collections of the sayings of the fathers, I think is the most likely thing going on here. It works well. It's a good summary of Athanasius's mature position after, a couple of decades after the Council of Nicaea itself, when he really returns to the word homoousios and begins championing it as the thing that is most helpful to say. So for him to say this, if you say that the Son is merely homoousios with the Father, that means that denies that the Son is God.
Right.
So the use of the word homoousios as the way of affirming the full deity of the Son.
Right. And, it strikes me oftentimes today people aren't so much a fan of Nicene orthodoxy, and especially the scholarly world. Nicaea is sometimes frowned upon as, such a later codification that imposes strictures that are a bit hard-nosed compared to earlier patristic sensibilities where things are a bit looser. I know someone like a David Bentley Hart often emphasizes there's this disjunct between the more meditative or spiritual earlier patristics and then a bit more of a crystallized formulaic even definition of Nicene orthodoxy. Not as though those must be opposed, but sometimes homoousios today is thought about in something of a negative light, or why would we want to affirm something of a strange word, something of a an interesting idea. They're same in essence, but I think Polanus shows by starting out really at the bottom line and then working up to homoousios through a series of denials, two of which are here in Axiom 3. He really emphasizes why it's so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in a systematic theology like this, Polanus is going for the doctrinal bottom line. He's looking for the statement of the doctrine. He's not intentionally engaging in, a work of patristics where he kind of traces how a term develops over the course of the 4th century. If you jump in and dig around in the actual 4th century development, you can have a perfectly good Christian life and never talk about ousia, the essence of God, and whether the Father and the Son have the same essence. Like, the question might not even come up because it's not directly a biblical term, right? The Bible will push you to think metaphysically in certain ways about the relation of the Father and the Son, but it doesn't just hand you the term ousia and say, now put the right prefix on this to get it right.
Or
and
else.
the different yeah, that's right. And the major pro-Nicene theologians, Athanasius, Cappadocians, Hilary, they're all sort of working different strategies for how to confess this properly. And homoousios was a political word originally. No one had used it except for, I guess, some heretics, some Sabellians had used the word improperly. And so theologians who want to bring it in and say, no, it's actually a really good word.
Yes, it had to be baptized by the,
Yeah, that's right. It had to be cleaned up, and you had to disavow the earlier use of it and say, here's what it does mean, here's what it doesn't mean.
It's true, and that brings to light here a really critical point to recall, and we've stressed this already. At this point, even in Polanus, we're not talking about how the persons are distinct. We're only talking about the persons with respect to the essence. That is all we're doing.
Oh.
And because of that, like, if you get those two categories confused, you're going to be in real trouble. And that's the issue with the Sabellian, or something like a Sabellian heresy, is that if you start to apply this in a wrong way, you're gonna get really messed up. But applied rightly to the persons with respect to the essence, and then considered essentially, it's a really helpful term.
Yeah. I should say, in the flow of the axioms we've been looking at so far, it starts with the divine unity, and it gets to the divine essence. And all of this is by way of saying, what does the word Trinity mean? Well, it can't mean anything that undercuts the absolute unity of God's essence. So Trinity has to live in personal distinctions rather than characterizing the essence of God itself. It's starting there that now it sort of makes sense that he would move into the same essence, the homoousios, because he's still talking about the divine essence. He's still not making his way, as you point out, to that which differentiates the persons. Right.
And maybe just looking a little bit more closely at the structure of Axiom 3 here, at least as I see it, there's kind of two moves that he cycles through. The first is a denial of dissimilarity. And I don't know about you, but I don't know of anybody who would actually affirm it would be pretty bad that the persons were dissimilar. And to my mind, this is kind of the weakest sense of unity that you could possibly conceive of. So it's the type of unity that I might have with my dog. So I'm distinguished from my dog via my rationality, and so I have a similarity perhaps at the level of my animality, but there's a real strong difference between us. And if you group us together underneath the genus of animal, at least as the Aristotelian old way of understanding animalia would have it, that would be something of a dissimilarity between us. And of course, that's not what we want to affirm. He then continues with a bit stronger sense of unity, but it still doesn't pass the test. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, and just to flag one thing about that opening that you just mentioned, he names a couple of sort of false positions that both make the mistake of saying that the Son and Spirit are the Father and the Son are dissimilar. So one is, he just takes the word homoion, those who say that it's similar, and puts a privative on the front, and homoion. And then he has this other word, which I just don't know,
Yeah.
Atianians. Yeah, I don't know if that's a reference to a teacher or when that way of describing it was popular. Just kind of sitting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then, as you say, that's such an obvious mistake to say that the Father and the Son are of different essences and they're not even similar essences. So he moves on from that to say, so then you might think since they're not dissimilar, they must be similar, but that's also not correct. How does he put this? The persons are not of a similar essence because, yeah, okay, this is hard. I don't know what to do with this. They are not similar essentially. For being similar in essence is one thing, being similar essentially is another.
Yeah, it was quite tricky for me to translate that. As far as I could tell, and it was a bit strange for me.
Yeah.
As far as I could tell, and he even goes on to say, the first, being similar in essence, kind of pictures the persons as within the essence of God, and somehow each owning the essence, maybe with also something that is proper to themselves, some positive perfection.
Yeah.
And so that would be similar in essence. And then similar, essentially, they each have their own essence, and then we're comparing those essences together is how I took that distinction. But admittedly, it was rather difficult to translate.
Yeah. So if you call if you call two things similar, essentially, that makes three essences. You have
Right.
three different essences which are similar to each other.
Right.
But if you call them similar in essence, then you have three persons who are similar in one essence.
Right. They're similar compared to each other, and in the fact that they each own the essence of God, but they also have a distinguishing feature.
So that's the right answer.
No, not quite.
It's not quite the right answer.
It's not quite. Polanus is going to take us even deeper than that.
The extremely wrong answer is they are not similar.
Right.
The pretty wrong answer is they are
similar essentially.
Yep. Similar essentially.
Yeah.
Because that would be three essences, which
Right.
we can then compare to each other and note that they are similar. And the still sort of wrong answer is three persons who are similar in one essence.
Right. Right. And
so what that gets right, the reason it's tempting, it gets right the fact that there are three persons.
Yeah, and one essence.
And one essence.
Right.
The problem is it describes that relation still by using the term similar.
Yeah, and what's being identified here is I think a really helpful thing for all of us to take note of today, and that is the tendency to think of each individual person as somehow distinguished by an absolute property or something like that, or an attribute, and that would make them similar in essence. That's the move. And so right from the start, even though we're not talking about how the persons are going to be really distinguished, constituted as really distinct, Polanus is shutting down, as all of the Orthodox positions shut down, that possibility of each person owning the essence of God, but being distinguished from each other by some perfection that only that person has in contrast to the other. So everything that is absolutely essential, that could be conceived as a positive perfection or an attribute, is going to be absolutely common. And so there's no differentiating feature that you can pick out and put your finger on that makes one not the other.
So if I were drawing a diagram, I'd have something representing the essence in the middle. I'd have three persons around it. And then the temptation is always to write something inside the little circle representing the first person so that I can put a feature in that circle that one has that the others don't. And the whole time I'm going to be saying, this is not the divine essence. This is just let this circle represent the Father.
Right.
What can I put in here that is I'll say a distinguishing mark that makes this one not this other one?
Absolutely.
And if you're doing this at a non-technical level, and I think Calvin's Institutes talks like this at a non-technical level. Book 1, chapter 13 on the Trinity. He says they each have a distinguishing mark.
Right. That's probably
now when you
that's probably notion there in the Latin, I would bet. I haven't looked at it.
Oh, that's a good question. When you dig down into it, though, to figure out what he means by distinguishing mark, like when I irritate students by drawing these circles on the board and saying, what distinguishing mark do I write in the Father's circle that he has that the Son doesn't have?
Mm-hmm.
You end up having to say something relational. That, in other words, something not in the circle,
right?
Something between Father and Son by which they are related. So if I put fatherhood in the circle, that's just sleight of hand. What I really mean is that between these two, fatherhood and sonship obtain in a particular ordered way.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that is, as far as I can see it, one of the greatest temptations is, just as you say, to write something in that circle, in that father circle, or to think of something being in that circle. And I see this all the time. And you find it in history. For instance, there's a position that believes you do constitute the persons by, as it were, writing something in that circle, by finding out some absolute perfection. There are even positions in church history that think there is something in the circle, but we just can't know what it is. So that's a position in a way that you could conceivably constitute the persons as really distinct. But it seems to me that none of the Orthodox boundary lines allow you to do that, because everything that you think of that's positive, every attribute that is ordered to the subject who has it, who's qualified or determined by it, that always leads you to what is absolutely common between the persons. And if you think that it's not, then you've fallen into tritheism. And that's such a great danger today.
So first, let me get Calvin off the hook here and say that when he does start to show his work a little bit, even in Institutes 113, it's all Gregory Nazianzus, all the way down, right? The terminology is from Tertullian by way of Augustine, etc. He doesn't use, for instance, the Greek term idiotetes, right? Which is kind of what the Cappadocians, they're looking for that that own
distinguishing
feature,
mark.
That each of distinguishing mark. So you can write, if you write Father in the circle, you're borrowing it from something between Father and Son. You're sort of moving, you're moving what actually belongs as a relational characteristic,
right,
into, as if they're into the personhood of the first person,
right, as though it's
what makes him different, as though it's an absolute, and then you do have this problem of, well, they're different. Well, that seems like it makes them different essences, tritheism. The last mistake Polanus tries to exclude, though, is there is one essence, and there are three persons, but it's still wrong to call them similar.
Right, because at the end of the day, similar requires you to have some positive attribute by which there is such that a comparison can then be made. Whereas the Orthodox position, broadly speaking, wants to deny that, but still allow that the comparison or the relation of fatherhood is precisely where we constitute the Father as really distinct from the Son. And, I always describe it like this, because, the patristics and all the Orthodox are just looking at what the Scripture has revealed. So I always say the Bible is not revealed, God has not revealed himself in Scripture under the names of Peter, James, and John. He doesn't give us absolute names that would connote some absolute perfection to distinguish each person. Rather, he reveals himself as Father, Son, Spirit. These are relative names. Relative names say a relation, and that's why we go for a relation, because it doesn't backfeed on the subject who has the relation and determine him in any way. It simply demands that we conceive the owner of that relation as really distinguished by virtue of the concept of relation. from another than that subject at that concept of relation, and that's really important. That's something we'll talk about more, I suppose, when we get to it.
Yeah. So if you have three essences, that's clearly tritheism. That's just, I mean, someone may deny that they're a tritheist, but if they affirm three essences, they just are. The more subtle mistake here, though, is if you do this thing you were just talking about, if you put a distinguishing mark within each person in some sort of absolute sense, that is not related, not by way of relation to another person, but just the Father's got fatherhood. It lives right there inside the Father.
Right.
But there's only one essence. Is that still tritheism? Is that, I mean, not like we've got to get the heresy label maker and stick it to somebody.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I always want to be really, really judicious personally, especially because, theology is so hard. Trinity is the hardest area of all theology. You know that far better than I do, having studied it for so many more years. And you just have to be really gracious and slow to condemn people, and at least in my opinion, just speaking for myself, I'll absolve you of you can have plausible deniability, but I just think this is more like the social Trinitarianism position. I look at a lot of guys today who really want to speak well of God, want to speak biblically of God, want to worship God, and genuinely are worshiping God fairly well, but they lack the technical expertise. And especially due to the fact that they're not reading all of these folks. If you look at the earliest patristics, they also lacked the expertise, not because they were stupid, but because it took so long to work this out. So if you pre-sin from the history of the development of dogma, you're going to have errors, and so I wouldn't want to call someone whose position defaults into this similar in essence. I wouldn't call them a tritheist, even though I'm certain I can force their position into a tritheist position. But it's different.
Yeah, so it's a kind of an unstable position, right? To say there is one essence and the Father's essence is similar to the Son's.
Right.
Like that's even grammatically, that's a little bit confusing to hold that position. And so it's going to have to settle down in one direction or the other.
Right.
Okay, interesting.
Just maybe another word on that, Fred. It's also interesting to me, and Thomas is really strong about this. Thomas Aquinas, who we all think of as so insanely precise and technical, and he certainly is, but he also talks about the fact that the Bible reveals God, or God reveals himself in the Bible in simple language for us simple folk like you and me to be able to understand, have faith, and come to know God truly. And Scripture reveals, Father, Son, Spirit, again, under relative names. So I don't think the relations account is too far away from Scripture. In fact, I think it's immediately demanded by it. But you do also have Jesus, who is the revelation of God, who publishes the name of Trinity, as Thomas says. And it's really easy to slip into this, I'm going to write the name Jesus, and that's a positive perfection in the Son box that distinguishes over, you know what I'm trying to say? It's like to slip in this similar in essence business is really, really easy, even given what Scripture reveals. And it's hard to be orthodox.
Yeah. When I ask the question, what's the difference between the Father and the Son? The most obvious answer is the Son became incarnate and the Father didn't. And that's a true answer. I'm going to give an A on the theology test for that one. Underneath that, though, you have this issue that, you just defined the distinction between the persons by something that happens in the economy of salvation. Yep. So God's self-identity is dependent on what happens for us in our salvation. So that's an error. Mm-hmm. But I mean,
but then again, that is what Scripture is giving us.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when someone says that's the difference between the Father and the Son, they are not intending all these ramifications of God identifies himself. God is constituted with reference to salvation history.
Right.
They certainly did not mean that.
Right.
They're not even on a slippery slope to meaning that. Now, you might ask a couple of diagnostic questions to say, like, do you think Father and Son could tell each other apart before the incarnation?
Right.
Right, and that might open up a world of trouble. But the person who gives the correct, simple biblical answer, especially because they're intending to say what the Bible teaches, they are not in error.
Yeah. Go
Let's
ahead.
see. Having gone through some of the sort of verbal gymnastics intentionally, right? Polanus has made a pedagogical decision that the way to teach this is to ring the changes on ousia compound words, and then to do things like similar in essence, but not similar essentially. Like he's banking on this will work. This will help people get their minds around it.
Yeah.
But then he says, but if we want to speak accurately, the persons of the deity should not be spoken of as actually similar in essence.
Right.
Similar and dissimilar are referred with respect to quality, and God is free from quality, as Basil the Great says.
Right.
What do you make of God is free from quality?
So he's talking about the Aristotelian category, an accidental category called quality. We have 9 accidental categories in addition to a substantial category to make the 10 Aristotelian categories. And these are the 10 categories of real creaturely being. So you take any real creaturely being and it's going to be reduced to somehow fall into one of these categories. When the Orthodox start to approach theology, they're always going to be using the most technical philosophical ideas available to them, but that doesn't mean that philosophy has all of a sudden come on equal level with theology, especially when we approach the issues of the divine mystery. So God is always, as far as I know, I mean, it would be a very rare individual indeed who would affirm that God can fall into one of the categories. So God doesn't fall under the category of substance because properly God is beyond creation or above creation, and the category of substance is what governs creation. Nonetheless, we use these categories because they're creaturely, philosophically precise buckets, as it were, to try to gain some understanding. So when we say there's no quality in God, we're affirming this basic preposition, Deus non est in genera, is the Latin. God is not in a genus. Quality is going to be similar to that. He's not in a category. And that's fundamentally why he's not going to be similar or dissimilar, because quality has that idea of absolute accident, which is a perfection which one subject has in contrast to another. So if I'm extra fat, that's a quality about me that someone skinny doesn't have. And you can look at me, who's extra fat today, and Mr. Skinny guy over here, and there's going to be a similarity between us by virtue of the quality. But of course, there's dissimilarity there as well. So that's what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful to flag that as Aristotelian, I think, and talk about these categories. So if you ask, is the Father like the Son or unlike the Son? He plays with that a little bit, but then he says, by the way, here's why that's a bad question. Here's why neither answer is correct.
Right.
The Father is neither like nor unlike the Son, because this like question is inadmissible to talking about God. It's as bad as if you started the question, so the Father's yellow. Is the Son red or orange?
Right.
Because red would be unlike, but orange would be like, there's a lot of yellow and orange.
Right.
And we could play with that a little bit if it helped us understand something, but eventually you're going to have to just stop and say, like, neither, because color on the visible spectrum is not something that it's meaningful to talk about when we're talking about the being of God. Apparently, quality itself is one of these categories that is super helpful in thinking well about created beings, but just doesn't get you anywhere in talking about the divine life.
Right.
He does, Polanus doesn't quote it, but there's a great a passage in Augustine on the Trinity, Book 5, where Augustine says that God is great without quantity and good without quality,
Right.
which is a real, stunning thing to say. Like, wait, he is great without quantity, isn't he? Because he's like, God is great, but he's not 100 great.
Right.
He's just great. Like, I always use numbers to talk about quantity.
Right.
But when I refer quantity to God, he has it, but not in such a way that I can apprehend it comparatively.
Yeah, and we mentioned that even earlier when we talked about God being beyond number. Similar thing is going on there. So.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that section in on the Trinity, Augustine's on the Trinity, Book 5, also works through almost all 9 of Aristotle's categories. It's a little hard to tell in Latin, and Augustine claims not to have read Aristotle very carefully. But when he starts out with quantity, equality, and works his way through, 7 or 8 more things, you think, oh, I see what you're doing.
Right. One other thing.
This reference. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to mention one other thing that really stood out to me that this axiom emphasized, and that is a common misunderstanding. Maybe you find it too, Fred, among folks. When we talk about the Son who proceeds through the intellect, and he's the Word, and the Spirit who proceeds through the will, and he is love, and these sorts of things. And if we're not really careful, we can start to think that the Son somehow owns more of the intellect or more of the knowledge of God than some other of the persons. And same for the Spirit with respect to the will or love. And this,
like, he has the mind part.
Right. And again, I think you mentioned at some point, maybe last time, about the parts view of God, the Father's own over here and the Son's own. We can quickly fall into that when we talk about the Son who proceeds through the understanding, which is what the Orthodox will do. But what this axiom is bringing us to affirm, and again, we're going to try to constitute the persons later, but for now, we need to establish clearly that the act of understanding and the intellect is going to be absolutely common to all 3 persons. It's not more properly the Word than it is the Father or the Son. And likewise, the act of loving and the will is not more the Spirit's than it is the Son's or the Father. All 3 persons.
I don't want to jump too far ahead, but the procession by way of intellect is about the Son and not about the Father, right? But not the intellect.
Right. And he has a procession, but I've just noticed that when we start talking about through intellect and the Word and knowledge, and that can quickly become confusing to people.
Nice. All right. Polanus doesn't. Well, when he quotes Basil the Great, he says that he's quoting from Basil's 141st letter. And I tried looking that up and I couldn't find it. And I thought, do I not know how to say 141 in Latin? The numbers are hard. I might have that wrong. It turns out 141 is what they used to call it. The Benedictine numbering system for the letters of Basil didn't kick in until 1730 after Polanus. So this is what we all call letter 8 now. It's one of his most famous doctrinal letters. It's good old Basil letter 8. Which locks down a whole lot of important terminology, including homoousios terminology.
Okay. Is that available?
Got that open in front of him.
Is that available?
Yeah, you can
online?
just Google Basil letter 8.
That's great. Well, I didn't know that, so I'm glad. Thank you for letting me know. I'll have to go read Basil letter 8.
Yeah, I'll link that on the blog. But
great.
All right. Well, I think that's Axiom 3. Axiom 4 is going to pick up other cool things to do with the word ousia. Including some really creative, strange ones that I had never encountered before.
The same.
Before reading Polanus.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we'll look forward to picking that up next time.
All right. Great talking to you, Ryan.
Thanks, brother.